Good morning, everybody. This is going to be the first of two recordings for a little preparatory stuff before our Vampire the Masquerade series starts to be released. The other one is going to be a lore-focused episode that will be dropping around the same time as this one. This one is a more mechanics-focused one, since there are now 5-ish versions of Vampire, and I have got Mr. Mathew Dawkins to come on and help me talk about it a little bit.
Yeah, hello. I should probably add at this point, I know nothing about Vampire the Masquerade's mechanics. This is going to be a fun... No, that's not true.
I've been swindled.
No, hopefully I'll be able to make it interesting and educational. I don't think much of the storyteller system that is used for Vampire the Masquerade is terribly complex, but bear in mind I am saying that with several years of experience as a vampire storyteller and player, as well as a writer. So I'll break it down into bite-sized chunks, and hopefully if you've got any questions as I'm talking, by all means interrupt, and I will do my best to answer.
That works out for me. I think March of last year was when we started recording Vampire, which has gotten super crazy now that it's been almost a year of us recording stuff.
Yeah, that's a long game. And March last year seems like about 30 years ago at this point. With the way the world is right now at time of recording, I'm sure it's not going to improve in the next week. But yeah, it's that's been quite a long time.
I was hoping that this was going to be a calmer year, and then all of a sudden, GameStop stock exploded.
But that's not why people are listening. People are listening to hear about Vampire the Masquerade, a much happier subject.
But yeah, you've been doing vampire stuff outside of just playing storytelling for a while now, right?
Yep. So I started playing and running storyteller games like Vampire the Masquerade. I think Vampire or Wraith was my first one. Way back, somewhere like 1999, year 2000. It was one of the very first role-playing games I got to read through from beginning to end, play and run. And I fell in love with the game, the setting, found the rules very simple and intuitive, and bought as many books as I could, read them all cover to cover repeatedly, and tried to make them the best games I ran at my gaming club. And luckily the players seemed to think so. So it gave me enough encouragement, confidence to just keep getting deeper and deeper down that vampire rabbit hole. When Vampire the Requiem came out, I really invested in that as well, and my players loved that too. And then we had Vampire the Masquerade 20th Anniversary Edition in about 2011, I think it was, and I just jumped on that as well. And then, of course, by about 2013, I was writing tabletop RPGs part-time on top of my job, which was primarily working as a trainer at various companies, a technical trainer, on all kinds of subject matters. And ultimately, I was picking up enough freelance contracts as a writer and as a developer of books, not just on Vampire the Masquerade, lots of role-playing games for lots of different companies, that I could do that full-time. So all of that, and not even mentioning the YouTube channel that I had running for years and years and years. But yeah, this is my life now, my working life and my hobby, which is quite a privileged position.
What else have you written for that wasn't World of Darkness related?
Wow, okay, so I've written for Call of Cthulhu, I've written for Green Ronin's Modern Age, I've written for Cult Divinity Lost, I have written for, going to be testing my knowledge at this point and insulting anyone that I forget. I've written for other more light-hearted games like Monarchies of Mao and Pugmire. I've written my own game, They Came From Beneath the Sea, and They Came From Beyond the Grave, which is a movie genre game. Beneath the Sea is a 1950s B-movie role-playing game, whereas Beyond the Grave is a 1970s and 19th century sort of exploitation hammer horror movie genre game. And yeah, a lot. I mean, on MathewDawkins.com, you can see my list of credits, and I work across role-playing games, board games, card games, video games, And you kind of have to in this industry, because just relying on sort of one it will never allow you to pay the mortgage,
No,
or keep food on the table. As a freelancer, you just have to keep looking around for work, and so that's what I spend a lot of my time doing. But yeah,
I feel that.
I'm in a very fortunate position where I have written on all the games I've ever wanted to, and so now I am in a position where I get to start making games that I want to make from scratch. And I do that largely through Onyx Path Publishing, who are one of the licensees of Vampire the Masquerade and the other World of Darkness games, as well as Chronicles of Darkness games. And they release some fantastic games, like They Came From Beneath the Sea and Beyond the Grave, and we've got another They Came From game coming up later this year. They are also currently kickstarting 2 games, Scion Dragon and Scion Masks of the Mythos. Scion is a game where you play the children of gods. Quite literally, you might be a child of Loki, a child of Zeus, child of pretty much any damn pantheon, because the Scion Origin and Scion Hero games that lay all that out have got so many options, and they have really been embraced and very successful since they were released. It sort of blends mythology with urban fantasy, and Mask of the Mythos is the Call of Cthulhu variant, where you are literally playing the children of gods like Cthulhu, Nyarlathotep, and Hastur, and Dragon takes you into a more fantasy mythological bent with the dragons in the name, but the artwork in those games is wonderful. Anyway, I'm mentioning all of that, and I'm sort of pitching it. I didn't even work on those Scion games, but I am in love with them. They are right now my favorite game going, and very much recommend anyone checks them out.
That's definitely way more than I've got. I think it was my senior year of high school. One of my friends invited me over to her house with a couple of people to have a party. I show up and I find out that they're doing a vampire LARP, and I had no idea what it was.
Yeah, well, I've LARPed and played tabletop. I'm a bigger fan of tabletop than LARP. LARP just isn't quite it just isn't my preference, to put it simply. I've done enough of it to know with a certainty that it isn't my thing. But nothing against people who do enjoy it. And I know of some fantastic LARP groups out there, obviously not really operating much now given the current climate in the world, but I have no doubt they will get back together as soon as they can.
I'm sure that people are excited about doing it. I saw some people that were talking about like online LARPs and stuff, which just sounds like a big, Discord setup, kind of play by post text kind of situation, but something to keep them going until things return to more normal.
Yeah, I mean, I used to run, or I founded a group called the Vampire the Masquerade YouTube experiment, where you had people playing over what was Google Hangouts at the time, and you could drop into different rooms. They were different like cities or different buildings in the vampire city. And you could drop into rooms, interact with other vampires via webcam, and your sessions were automatically recorded and then uploaded to YouTube, because that's what Hangouts on Air used to do. And we ended up building up this massive bank of YouTube actual plays. This was before the sort of podcast actual play boom. And it's interesting that kind of wheel has turned now, and as you say, lots of LARP groups, lots of tabletop groups who can't meet in person right now are using mediums like that to role play. And while it may not necessarily scratch the same itch fully, it is good that people are still finding new ways to role play.
Yeah, and it's more about keeping this connection, because I imagine a lot of LARP troops out there had been going for years probably at this point.
Yeah, definitely. So, some of them for decades.
Yeah, which to me is a crazy thought. I imagine that they have reset and blown up their canon and stuff, so that it's not like the same game for those 10 years. Because I couldn't imagine running the same game for that long.
I would hope so, because if I know anything about Vampire the Masquerade LARP groups, it's that they have probably killed around 250 princes in the course of the last 10 years if they've been running that long, because my experience of LARPs is the prince is almost always the first vampire targeted in the domain for destruction. Because you have players who naturally want to ascend, climb up the hierarchy and install themselves as a prince. They end up doing so, and then someone assassinates them, and so it goes.
It's funny because somebody posted the GIF from Futurama of the water planet where they keep drinking their previous rulers just a few weeks ago.
Yeah, very appropriate.
Yeah, there's a lot of history to Vampire. We're on our 5th edition now. Then that doesn't count Requiem technically, yes?
No, Requiem is a separate game line. Shouldn't be confused with Masquerade. While it shares some terms and terminology, it is a completely different universe. And I will brook no addition warring, because essentially, whenever people raise Requiem and Masquerade, it often causes some kind of hackles to raise, as if one has usurped the other or ruined the other, and that's not the case at all. They're two completely different games, just like Supernatural and Buffy are different shows. And in terms of Masquerade, you do have five editions, as V5 implies, but confusingly, 4th edition is called Vampire the Masquerade 20th Anniversary Edition.
Yeah, I believe I heard on one of the other podcasts that you may have been on that episode that 20th Anniversary was supposed to just be like a reissue, air quotes, of the stuff that had came before it into one book, but then it got so popular that more stuff came out. Am I wrong on that?
Kind of, yeah. So there's been 20th anniversary books now for Vampire the Masquerade, Werewolf the Apocalypse, Mage the Ascension, Wraith the Oblivion, and Changeling the Dreaming. And Vampire the Masquerade was the first one. And when Vampire the Masquerade's 20th anniversary edition was launched through a pre-order service, this is predating Kickstarter, you could basically order it in a deluxe copy, and at that time, that was all that was going to be sold. It was just going to be a deluxe, leather-bound version of Vampire the Masquerade. The rules had barely been updated. Most of the text was brand new, but it wasn't adding anything to the previous editions of Vampire. It was
just compiling it, right?
It was a compilation, but rewritten to be more readable, more up-to-date, that kind of thing. Some of the text is identical, because some of the rules things just didn't need changing, and rewriting them would be pointless. But things like clan descriptions and the like were rewritten. Now, as you say, V20, as it's called, was a tremendous success. And CCP, the video game company that owned the license to Vampire the Masquerade at the time, recognized this. Their White Wolf branch, who were the tabletop RPG and World of Darkness MMO writers of the time, suggested, well, why don't we continue producing this? It's not going to cost CCP anything really to do, so why don't we do it? Because there's clearly an audience there. They agreed to it, and that's how you ended up with all of the supplements for V20. Now, when you get to Werewolf 20, Mage 20, and so on, first of all, it was White Wolf, then it was Onyx Path, who were the only people doing this, got increasingly bold with the kind of content they could include. They could start creating new material and putting it in these 20th anniversary editions. So as you look at the successive games or successive source books for the games, in the case of Vampire and Werewolf, you find that the meta plot, as it's often called, sort of canon for that game world, has expanded significantly from what it was in its previous edition. So the last 20th anniversary edition book, in essence, is Changeling the Dreaming. And Changeling the Dreaming never had a third edition. It only had first and second. It was cancelled before it got a third edition. And so technically C20 is its 4th edition, but it's its 3rd edition, my apologies. And it completely overhauls a lot of the redundant rules, setting information, all kinds of stuff. So that's a brand new game in its own way. And same goes for Wraith 20. But yeah, that is in short the story of V20 and what that is. V5 was the new edition of Vampire the Masquerade published by Paradox Interactive. Paradox are mostly known for Crusader Kings games and other such video games. Very popular company with very popular games. And they had purchased the Vampire the Masquerade and World of Darkness license from CCP, and therefore all of the various trademarks and copyrights and so on that were associated with the World of Darkness and so on, with a mind to launching Vampire and the associated games on a transmedia level. You'd get tabletop role-playing games like V5. You'd also get video games for Vampire and Werewolf and Wraith. And that's what we're seeing now. Because Paradox aren't a tabletop role-playing game company. They are, on one level, a video game company, but on another, a transmedia one. They want to see World of Darkness everywhere. And it's quite exciting, as a fan of the World of Darkness, to see it enter all of these different mediums.
And they've been doing some other stuff too, like in addition to traditional games like Earthblood that's supposed to be coming out in Bloodlines 2, they've done a couple of visual novels through different people.
Yep, quite correct. Paradox don't make those games themselves. There have been games in progress that occasionally the Paradox may have had a direct hand in. But yeah, in the case of Earthblood, I believe the studio making that is Nacon, and in the case of Bloodlines 2, that's Hardsuit. And yeah, you have lots of visual novels, as you say. They're all made by different studios in different parts of the world who essentially license the license from Paradox in order to make these games, with Paradox's oversight and approval of the content.
Of course, as our licensing agreements tend to be.
Yep.
I believe they're trying to make this 5th edition of all of the various mediums more compatible, because one thing that was, whenever I saw it brought up on the different subreddits, it was like, hey, I want to run like a vampire and a werewolf and a mage, and it's like, whoa. Not even close to balanced or fair there, buddy.
Well, so initially when World of Darkness 5th edition was announced, the big headline was one World of Darkness, where, as you say, vampires and werewolves mages could all sort of interact. They wouldn't necessarily get on, but they wouldn't necessarily all go for each other's throats either. And while that was very much, again, a headline view, big picture view, nothing granular had been developed at that point, like a TTRPG for Vampire the Masquerade or a 5th edition for Werewolf. So it will be interesting, because even I don't know how this is going to play out. How Werewolf 5th edition, Mage 5th edition, should we get a Mage 5th edition? No reason to doubt that we might, but nothing's been announced yet. How they will interact with each other.
I couldn't see not getting, at the very least, the 4 major flavors, we'll say, of World of Darkness.
Well, my guess, and it is pure guesswork, but based on my assessment of Paradox as a company and how they're measuring the licenses, essentially, what seems to be popular, what video games are getting made, we know that there is a vampire game being made. Makes sense. There's a V5 out. We know that there are werewolf games being made, so it makes sense to make Werewolf 5th edition, and it is being made. And there is also a Wraith video game coming out in VR. And so I have a suspicion that there'll be a Wraith 5 before a Mage 5. But that is just a suspicion. For all I know, there's a dozen Mage video games being made, and I just am not in the loop on it. But it will be interesting to see how it plays out and how all of those little cogs interact.
Yeah, especially with the past year, the way things have been, there's no telling what is stuck in some kind of delay or other various paperwork problems.
Oh, yeah. Well, Paradox have taken the development of all core rulebooks in-house, so all eyes will be on Paradox Interactive for the creation of further core rulebooks.
Trying to think where I'm going with this next jumping off point. So I feel like we talked a little bit about the history, a little bit about the World of Darkness, and how there are other things from our
If you want to ask what Vampire the Masquerade is about, I can go into that.
And then we can go into rules. That seems like a good place to start. Because, it's supposed to be a vampire game.
Yep.
Has Vampire always had the same kind of ongoing themes and stuff? I've heard in V20 and potentially earlier that it was a lot more undead superheroes with a mana bar, where 5th edition is much more personal horror and personal intrigue based.
Well, that's an interesting question, because you could ask any number of storytellers that question and they would all tell you different things about how they ran Vampire. But there was certainly a trend in previous editions of Vampire to lean more and more into the, I guess, epic powers side of things. The expectation that you might play with elders, you might play with the meta plot, so you might be interacting with various iconic characters and events, and that then therefore resulted in sort of globe-trotting vampires solving mysteries, if to put it very simply. Now, I like meta plot, I'm a big fan of it, I know a lot of it, but I also very much like the street-level hyper-personal vampire stories, because that has a little more horror, a little more pathos to it. And V5 has that embedded in its code, if you like. Whereas V20 and its previous edition, what was called Revised Edition, the 3rd edition, were all about the sects, the Camarilla, the Sabbat, the Anarchs, and how they would interact with each other. Mostly conflict, and was all about the princes and the Primogen and so on. Basically, it looks at things at a global level. V5 looks at things on a sort of block-by-block level, a street level. So you don't necessarily care about who the prince is one city over. You don't care about who the antediluvian, the founder of your clan, is. You care about the vampires that live on the other side of the street, or just a few blocks away, because they might be horning in on your territory. And so your relationship with mortals is, by design, through rules as well as setting, closer in V5, and your war, if you're engaged in one, is likewise a lot more personal. It's slinging rocks out of windows rather than firing rocket launchers at demigods.
It's actually one of the things I like a lot about V5 from just the thematic perspective, is how they are trying to bring all clans to all sects with a little asterisk on it.
Yeah. That again was by design. We wanted, when we worked on V5, the core book, and it was my pleasure to work on that core book and almost every source book that's come out for it since. The idea is to make it as playable as possible, and that means providing players with options, but not so many as to give them sort of choice paralysis, and to also make all of those options, each of the clans, have a role to play. Now, I'm a big fan of the 3rd edition of Vampire the Masquerade. It's what really got me into Vampire, and also V20, which is just an extension of 3rd edition, really. But I will tell you that reading through the core book for 3rd edition and V20, while you may see clans like the La Sombra and the Giovanni profiled there, it doesn't really give you any advice as to how to play them. And it doesn't really give you any advice as to their placement in the setting. That's my view. Others may feel free to disagree. In V5, there is a definite focus on who are you and what is your role in the world of darkness. What is it likely that you are going to do and encounter? What are your foes going to be, depending on who you are? Essentially, one of my frequent colleagues on XPath, a lady by the name of Rose Bailey, has always extolled the virtue of creating systems that show off the setting, essentially, and vice versa, rather than having a system that you can just kind of layer over a setting and hope that it works. I use D20, I use GURPS, but you can argue that those kind of generic systems are that. They are systems that are functional, but not necessarily flavorful. In V5, the system is there to evoke the themes of the game, the things like the hunger that's part of the system. You're constantly on the edge of frenzy, giving into your beast and becoming a wild predator on the streets of whichever city you happen to dwell in. That's all not only part of the setting, but it's also part of the system. So that means when you make a dice roll, it feels significant to do it. And I think that's very important. It was one of our big sort of mission statements with V5, and personally I think we succeeded with that.
I do really like the new hunger system and how it works out in a lot of its different aspects, because the little bit of V20 that I played through a play-by-post campaign, it was like, okay, I've got so many blood, but like I never really remember any hunting scenes that weren't more than just like a roll, find some dude in a Walmart bathroom and, have a little sip.
Yeah, and a lot of it comes down to storyteller, undoubtedly, because, again, any type of game can be played with any kind of system. But again, V5 shows off the setting with its system, which is the marked difference. What I would say to any people listening who do want to play previous editions of Vampire, and they look at the blood pool system and they think, as you say, it's a mana bar, for instance.
Yeah.
Then the best way to make that system evoke any kind of tension or any kind of horror is to make the blood points that you have tangible. Have red beads in front of you. Have dice in front of you to represent them. When you have an actual object that you are losing as you are using it, the player, will become more aware of it and more concerned about it. Whereas if it is just a chart on a character sheet, you won't care unless the storyteller keeps referencing it, which they probably won't.
My suggestion in that case would be to slightly tweak your idea and instead of little beads, make them actual candy that they can eat when they use it.
Yeah, that works. I mean, I played in a survival horror role-playing game once, using Chronicles of Darkness's rule system, which is like the evolution of World of Darkness, if you like. And it was, zombie survival horror. And our characters had bullets in front of us, and the storyteller had provided us with spent shell casings, and whenever we fired a bullet, we had to get rid of one of our shell casings. So it made you crucially aware of the fact that you were running out of ammunition as the story was going on. And again, it's a very simple trick, and it really only works if you're playing in person or at a convention, let's say. But it's incredibly evocative. It's a very good way of bringing players into the moment.
For sure. I am a big fan of using the right system to tell the story that the table is trying to tell, where in the case of Vampire, if you want that more personal, street level, personal horror coming up from the bottom kind of story, V5 does a really, really good job at that. If you want that more epic globetrottery stuff, maybe V20 would fit better. At least at current, anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I will always say you can do whatever you like with any system, but definitely I agree with you. V20 lends itself to an all-expansive game. If you want a bells and whistles Vampire the Masquerade game that can do absolutely anything you want, go for V20. If you want a street-level personal horror role-playing game, go for V5. At least if you want the easy route to either. So I should start talking about the rules, shouldn't I?
Oh, I suppose that would be something that would be helpful to introduce to people who may not be familiar with the system and setting.
Well, so first of all, just a little bit on the setting. In Vampire the Masquerade, you are playing vampires. You're playing undead creatures who quite often have only just been embraced. To be embraced is when you have just been turned into a vampire. So you and your fellow kindred, that's the sort of code name for vampires in this game, are undead who generally exist in an urban environment, and you are going to go through the struggles of not only being someone who has recently died and has to keep their life together or unlife together as a result, including all their mortal contacts. You also find yourself plunged into a sort of clandestine world that hides behind a masquerade where lots of other vampires dwell. Some of them will be friendly, unlikely. Some of them might be supportive. Most of them will be antagonistic because you are all jockeying for the same thing, which is blood and territory, dominance. You've potentially got an eternity now, so the sooner you can get your foot on the ladder, the better, because this isn't going to be a dead man's shoes situation. You can't just wait for your employer to retire. Vampires will last forever. Doesn't mean you always have to kill each other, but it does mean that you will always be working to win favor with other kindred. Now, in Vampire the Masquerade, that is represented through the political system, the Camarilla, which is the very masquerade-heavy sect who believe we should always hide from humanity, we should tightly enforce rules on each other, and the pecking order should never be disrupted. This is the way it's always been. This is the way it always will be. They are an elite club. You have to sort of pay a high price, generally morally, to get into the Camarilla. But if you do, then congratulations, you get to go to all the exclusive parties and meet all the famous vampires. The other main sect is the Anarch movement. The Anarch movement aren't all anarchists, but they are vampires who don't necessarily belong to the Camarilla and may want to exist in their own way without the Camarilla rules, and may wish to experience a little more freedom, may want to have a little more contact with humanity, may want to stay in touch with their own humanity, which the Camarilla quite steadily sheds like a snake. So those are your two options. And you have a bunch of clans, a good handful of them. In the older editions, there's 13 of them. In this edition, there's pretty much 15 playable options at this point, which is impressive. And each of them has a different role to play in Vampire the Masquerade. They each uphold a different archetype of vampirism. So you have your dominating vampires, you have your feral vampires, you have your sort of fashionista and art-obsessed vampires, you have your hideous Nosferatu vampires, and so on. They all fulfill a certain vampire stereotype from media, so you can immediately get what they're about. And a part of the clan design, when they were designed way back in the early 90s, was they were designed with certain D&D Dungeons & Dragons classes in mind, so that players could simply slip in to the role of a certain vampire clan and think, okay, well, I'm playing the fighter. Or, okay, I'm playing the wizard. And so if your only experience is through Dungeons and Dragons, you should be able to find a clan that fits the kind of class you like to play. But unlike Dungeons and Dragons, Vampire the Masquerade isn't a D20 game. It doesn't use the D&D 5th edition system. It uses what's called the Storyteller system. The Storyteller system uses pools of 10-sided dice, a D10 dice pool. Now, the number of dice you roll is affected by the number of dots you have in certain traits on your character sheet. Your traits are divided into attributes. These are your natural abilities, if you like, your strength, your intelligence, your manipulation, that kind of thing. And your skills, which are often learned, things like firearms, things like occult, things like finance, if you like. There's lots of different skills. And in order to ascertain how many dice you need to roll, you add up the number of dots you have in the corresponding attribute and the number of dots you have in the corresponding skill. So let's say I am trying to, I don't know, fix a car or start a car quickly because there's a werewolf chasing me down the street. And in typical horror movie mode, I drop my keys somewhere back on the road, so I've now got to hotwire it. I may need to use my wits attribute. So let's say I've got 3 dots in that, and my technology skill. So let's say I've got 2 dots in that to repair the car, to hotwire it and get the hell away. Maybe that's what I'm doing. That gives me 5 dice to roll. 3 from wits, 2 from technology. Now in this system, when you roll your 5 dice, you don't add the results together. You just take a note of each result you have rolled. Anything that's a 1 to a 5 is considered a failure. If you fail, you might as well just push those dice aside. They're not important anymore. If you roll a 6 to a 9, that's a success. Congratulations. So let's say the difficulty to hotwire this car is 2. That means I need 2 6s or above in order to manage it. If I roll a 10, that's a success. But if I roll a pair of 10s, that counts as 2 successes. If I roll 4, so each pair of 10s is basically worth, I'll say that again. You can edit that. Basically,
more work for later.
Yeah. So each pair of 10s you roll is worth 4 successes. So that's good. The storyteller can be generous and allow you to win at a cost. So let's say you get insufficient successes. Our fleeing vampire in this case only gets 1 success and needed 2. They might succeed, but at a cost, which might be something like the werewolf has picked up your scent, or the car breaks down about a mile down the road, or the police come after you, that sort of thing. You can get total failures, which is when you roll no successes at all, and usually when total failure happens, the storyteller will punish you in some way. If you're at all familiar with critical failures in other role-playing games, you'll know the kind of thing. And you have a trait in this game called willpower. Willpower is derived from your two attributes, your resolve attribute and your composure attribute. You add the 2 figures together, the numbers of dots in each. That results in your willpower. It gives you a pool of willpower that you can spend, and you can spend willpower to re-roll dice. 3 regular dice, for instance, for each willpower spent. If you have played games with things like luck points or moxie points, or I know there are things like this in Shadowrun 2, you can get your re-rolls in. So that, at a very basic level, is the system. It's a D10 dice pool system. You add the number of dots you have in an attribute to the number of dots you have in a skill. You roll that number of dice, and the 6s and above are what you're looking for. That's your successes.
I really like dice pool-based systems because it's something that you can look at and you can be like, I am this good at this thing, where something like a D20-based system is a 5% chance of any number coming up, and it's just kind of like that.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of probabilities and the like, there's benefits to different systems depending on what you're looking for. The storyteller system, which Vampire the Masquerade uses, is derived from the D6 dice pool system that Shadowrun used in its first, has always used, but it was created in Shadowrun before it was used for Vampire. And I think Ars Magica as well, which predated Vampire. But anyway, you're not here to hear me be the RPG historian. So, other elements of the system. And here's the parts of the system that really apply if you are a vampire and not just a mortal, because mortals will be rolling these kinds of dice pools as well. Every single time you roll your dice, in V5, you have these things called hunger dice. Now, hunger is a new system invented for V5. In previous editions, you had this thing called a blood pool. A blood pool was a numerical tracker, essentially, of the amount of blood you had in your system, which translated into the amount of blood you could use to activate special abilities. When that blood got low, you needed to refill it, therefore you fed from someone. Simple as that. In V5, you have hunger. And hunger is a system that is constantly there on your character sheet. Your character will very, very rarely have less than 1 hunger. And hunger goes up to a rating of 5. The more hungry you get, the more hunger dice you add to your dice pool in exchange for your regular dice. So what I recommend when you're playing Vampire the Masquerade is you have some dice that are a different color to the other D10s, and that, let's say, set of black dice are your hunger dice. They're still D10s, but you replace your regular dice with them for every point of hunger you have on your character sheet. So, what does that mean? Well, if I make that technology and wits roll, and I have my 5 dice, and let's say I have hunger 2 on my sheet, 3 of those dice will be regular, 2 of those dice will be hunger dice. And the results I get on my hunger dice will affect the way my vampire works. If I just get a normal success, a 6 to a 9 on the hunger dice that I roll, brilliant. No major effect. I keep complete control. It works. Wonderful. However, if I get a 10 or 0 on a hunger die, the result is a messy critical. That's what it's called in V5. It means that your success, while successful and superlatively so, is the sort of success that an animal, a predator in the wild would capitalize on. You know, you're out of control. You do what you're trying to do, but you do it with a certain amount of ferocity. You might display your supernatural power openly without intending to. You will still succeed, but you will succeed messily, and that can cause all kinds of ramifications down the road. Likewise, if you roll a 1 with your hunger dice and you fail, you get a bestial failure. So let's say I rolled no 6s or above, and one of my hunger dice was a 1. Well, that's a bestial failure, which means I am forced to act out a compulsion. Different vampire clans have different compulsions tied to them, but this can be something as simple as immediately sating my hunger. So if there's a mortal nearby and all I'm trying to do is hotwire a car, I leap out of the car and just drain that poor bastard who's next to me. I might choose to make that bestial failure a suffering of aggravated damage, which is the equivalent of being burned by the sun. Essentially, that would be the beast inside me sort of tearing at my insides and causing me immense pain. Or I could just increase my hunger by getting a bestial failure. Bestial failures can be translated into any number of things. Now, it may sound strange that I'm emphasizing this possibility of rolling a 1 on a failure to get what amounts to a critical failure in a sense. But this part of the system is part of what makes you feel like you're playing a vampire and not just someone who has a bunch of stats on a sheet. Because the possibility that you may give in to your beast at any point is hanging over you. And the more hungry you get, the less you feed, to put it another way. So you're trying to, let's say, stave off the monster, so you're not feeding. The more hunger points you're going to have, therefore the more hunger dice you're going to roll, therefore the more likely it is you will get a messy critical, or a bestial failure. So
if memory serves, in previous editions, weren't frenzies the only time you really lost control of the beast a little bit?
Yeah, and you can still frenzy in this game if you're exposed to, let's say, a massive fire, or if someone, let's say, mows someone down with a car and you're spattered with their blood, you are still likely to frenzy, but now in this game, you're more likely to. It doesn't mean all vampires are running around wild, but it means that the possibility is there.
Yeah, and they're not, the bestials and the messy successes aren't as bad as, say, a frenzy situation, but it is something to remind you that you are a monster.
Exactly. So one of the questions I saw you were asked on your Discord was regarding blood potency, and this is another change in V5. So blood potency is something that was actually introduced in Vampire the Requiem 2nd edition and was used in V5. And the blood potency is, as the name implies, a measure of how potent, how strong your vitae, your magical vampire blood, is. And the power of your blood potency can basically affect various things through your roleplay, all the way from how many dice you can add with a blood surge. You can basically make your blood surge to give you additional powers. Your blood potency allows you to mend a certain level of superficial damage. The more potent your blood, the more you can mend. It allows you to add bonus dice to your discipline powers. Discipline powers are your vampire's magical abilities, essentially to do things like hypnotize, run over water, punch your fist through a chest, that sort of thing. Allows you to get re-rolls on your discipline checks. It also, however, has a downside in that the higher your blood potency, the more your bane severity. Bane, every clan has a bane. It is essentially the curse that is specific to your vampire family. And the more powerful you get, the more severe that curse becomes, essentially. And also, blood potency restricts what you can drink. When you're a wee fledgling of a vampire who has only just been embraced, you can drink from animals, you can drink from blood bags, the world is your oyster, you barely feel like you're undead. However, as your blood potency increases, and it does with age, you are increasingly restricted. Eventually, you can only feed from humans, and eventually, after that, you can only feed from other vampires. And that means your blood potency has got very powerful indeed.
I really like how blood potency does a lot of different things, both good and negative, and gives you a reason for some of these older, more powerful vampires to exit the scene when it's like, look, it's getting real hard to keep fed, so I'm just going to go take a nap for, 150, 200 years, and then I'll be back.
Yeah, exactly. And as I said, this is something that was introduced in Requiem. There's a few systems that you will be able to see in V5 that if you've ever played Requiem 2nd Edition, you will recognize. But it's one of the best elements of Requiem 2nd Edition, so I was very pleased to see it ported over to V5 too. Other elements of the system that might be of interest. I saw someone ask about generation, because in previous editions of Vampire, your vampire's strength was largely, supernatural strength was largely governed by their generation. So every vampire has a generation, which implies how close they are to their clan founder, the vampire that started their family. The closer they are, the more powerful they are, or more capacity they have for power. In previous editions, this translated to you having a larger blood pool. It allowed you to spend more blood points per turn, that kind of thing, and access higher level disciplines. In this edition, what generation does is it affects your maximum and your minimum blood potency. Therefore, if I am freshly embraced as, and this is a very powerful vampire, as a 7th generation vampire, for instance, my minimum blood potency is going to be something, let's see, in fact, I think I've got it noted here, 3, which means right from the start, I can only feed from humans. I don't think 3, oh no, animal and bag blood slakes no hunger at that point, so you are immediately feeding from mortals. But likewise, your max blood potency can only reach a certain limit if your generation is somewhere like 13th or 14th. You're so far away from your founder, you will never get to the power level that they are at. So generation is still a crucial element of the game, but it isn't the be-all, end-all that it was in previous editions.
Breaking the two of them up into generation and blood potency does a lot, in my opinion, to keep it from being just like the one singular god stat, because sure, you can spend experience points to raise your blood potency to get thicker vitae and such, but you got to actually do a certain thing to lower that generation, to raise your ceiling, as it were.
Yeah, exactly. It's quite a nuanced little system. It's not complicated, but as you say, in previous editions, people would create characters and they would put all of their starting points into generation just so they could start off again with the capacity for a lot of power. The laugh of it was, or the trick of it was, that even though so many players would put 5 dots in generation, they never had that power at the start of their chronicle. So, and they very rarely played for long enough to build to that level. So it was always a bit pointless. But blood potency is a lot more intuitive, in my opinion.
Yeah, I like it a lot in how it does all of the different things. Like, given as some of the powers and disciplines that vampires are going to be using can call for these rouse checks that might risk them getting hungrier, your blood potency giving you the opportunity to re-roll those dice that may have failed so that you can not get hungrier is really good. But if you start getting up to where it gets harder for you to feed, it's like, okay, sure, you may not get as hungry, but when you do get hungry, it's a little bit more difficult to slake that hunger.
Yeah, well, let's talk about rouse checks briefly, because that's a new mechanic for V5 as well. Whenever your character wakes up in the night, so they've been sleeping during the day, they wake up at night, they have to perform what's called a rouse check. A rouse check is, as the name implies again, you rousing yourself from your slumber to go into your evening's activities. Now, you make a roll of a single die. This is your rouse check. If you succeed on that roll, congratulations, your hunger does not budge. It stays at what it was the night before. However, if you fail, your hunger increases by 1, which means, of course, you will end up rolling more hunger dice in future and until you feed. So again, that feeling of hunger is ever present in V5. It's always hanging over you. You also have to perform rouse checks when you perform various special abilities, your disciplines. A lot of your discipline powers, especially the higher level discipline powers, require you to make a rouse check before you can activate your power. Now, again, what this means is, in order to do something like get into someone's head and convince them that they never saw you, they don't remember you, and in fact, they don't even remember how they got here, you're going to have to perform a rouse check before you can do it. And that means that by exerting your effort in that way, rousing your vitae, you are potentially making yourself more hungry. Again, playing into the idea that vampires are creatures born by hunger. That is what they are carried on. And yeah, it plays quite beautifully with the idea of vampires being predators, because no matter how much you may wish to control it, that hunger will always be there.
Unless you want to start committing murder.
Yeah. If you diablerize another vampire, that is to say, you drink another vampire's blood and soul, if you like. I mean, that's very much an opinion whether vampires even have souls. You can reduce your hunger all the way to 0. It's about the only way you can reduce your hunger to 0. But it also... I think if you drink from mortals, you have to... if you kill the mortal, you can reduce it to 0. That is true. So yes, if you kill mortals or diablerize other vampires, cannibalize them essentially, you can reduce your hunger to 0. Now, one of the fun little system elements in V5 also is this thing called blood resonance. This is purely for the storyteller to adjudicate, really. I won't go into it in too much detail, but the idea is that different blood has different effects. And it isn't this person's A positive, this person's AB, or what have you. It's the person you're drinking from is inhabited by a certain emotion right now, or they are controlled by it, overridden by it. This is your dyscrasia, or dyscrasia. I've never known how to pronounce it, but it's your blood resonance. And what this amounts to is this person feeling melancholic? Is this person feeling angry? Is this person feeling joyful? That sort of thing. Because depending on how the person is feeling, depending on what's going on in their life, when you feed from them, you gain special abilities, special bonuses. They're very minor. They tend to be very, very minor. But it's a wonderful little feature of the game that is in the V5 core book. And we've got more of these dyscrasias coming up in one of the books Onyx Path Publishing putting out. Trails of Ash and Bone is what that one's called. And you can essentially do things like make yourself slightly more persuasive for the night by drinking from someone who is incredibly confident. Or you might make yourself more capable of hiding in the shadows by feeding from someone who's incredibly shy or retiring, that sort of thing. So it makes the feeding process more than just, I need to top up my pool, or I need to just reduce my hunger. Now I'm feeding for a purpose because I need this kind of ability for the night. And it again adds that level of predation to the vampire you're playing.
And some potentially dark connotations, as you're like, well, I'm looking to feed off somebody who is sad, so I'm going to go and I'm going to arrange for them to lose their job, have their car repossessed.
Yep.
And all of that stuff to manipulate their emotions or...
Absolutely. It's not always easy to just find someone who is feeling a certain way. Sometimes you have to engineer it. And that kind of toying with your prey is where the humanity system comes in.
Segways.
Yeah, it's magnificent, isn't it? So in every edition of Vampire the Masquerade, you've had this trait called humanity. Humanity governs how moral your character is, how ethical they are. And in V5, the system has changed slightly. Humanity ranges from 0 to 10. Most characters start around 7. That's the base human average. Now, what each point on the humanity track means is ultimately irrelevant. What is relevant is the fact that whenever your character does something that goes against one of their personal convictions, and it's recommended, in fact, it's guaranteed, you should write your character's convictions down. If you basically go against your convictions, your principles, let's say your conviction is I will never allow harm to befall a child. So that's a very easy one. That is your belief. That's your moral breaking point. You will never allow harm to befall a child. Well, one of the vampires in your coterie, your gang of vampires, feeds from a child because they're damn hungry, and you find out about it, and you did nothing to stop them, and you don't even punish them for it because you're afraid of them. You gain what is called a stain on your humanity. So let's imagine that your humanity is 7 out of the possible 10. The dots of that humanity that are not filled in, so 8, 9, and 10, are how many stains you have to accumulate before you have to perform what is called a remorse roll. So, let's say your conviction is I won't allow a child to be harmed in my presence or what have you. So that happens. You can put a line through number 10 because that is your first stain. Let's say you've got another conviction, which is I will always provide for my family, my mortal family, despite the fact I'm a vampire. Well, you've been so consumed by vampire politicking that you find out that your aged mother has just been kicked out of her flat by her landlord. Well, that's another stain because you failed. You failed your mother. You failed to uphold your conviction. So when you hit 7 in this case, you've got your 3 stains. You then make a roll versus the number of stains on your pool. So in this case, it will be 3 stains, and on a failure, if you fail your roll, your beast wins and your humanity decreases. It's very sad, but that is how your humanity goes down in Vampire the Masquerade. If you succeed, however, you basically go through some kind of trial of remorse. You agonize over it. You feel bad about it. You come to the conclusion that you've done a wrong thing and you'll try and be better in future. Because vampires always do this in media. They always get to that point where they're rending their clothing and thinking, why did I allow this to happen? Why have I become a monster? Well, if you actually have that moment and you take away something from it that makes you a better person, that's you succeeded on your remorse roll. Your humanity has not decreased this time, but you would be just as eligible to accumulate stains in future. Now, you can essentially keep stains off your back, or the only way to keep stains off your back is by having these convictions, because you can essentially eliminate your stains by upholding your convictions, and you can only have convictions if you have something called touchstones. For every 1 touchstone, you have a conviction, or to put it another way, every conviction you have a touchstone, and that touchstone must be connected to the conviction. Touchstones were things introduced again in Vampire the Requiem 2nd edition. In V5, they are always mortals who are of importance to you in some way. It could be someone you love, it could be someone you care for, it could be a friend from your past, it could be a colleague from your past, it could be someone you are obsessed with and you obsessively protect. Now, if, let's say, you always wish to protect your family, I'll never, let them get kicked out of the flat, your touchstone may well have been your aged mother in this case, because the two are linked. But while having a touchstone gives you a benefit, because having a touchstone allows you to have a conviction, if you don't have them, well, bad luck, you're going to accumulate stains very quickly. If your touchstone gets harmed, This is the negative effect of having them. You are more likely to fall into frenzy. You're more likely to accumulate stains because you weren't there to look after them. So it's a double-edged sword. But even elder vampires centuries of age, have touchstones because it's about the only way they can keep control of themselves. They have to stay rooted to humanity in some way, so they keep mortals around them to do so.
It also gives the storyteller wonderful buttons to press.
Yep. They shouldn't always be used as sacrificial lambs by storytellers. That's a bit cruel, but they should certainly be characters that get into trouble. They should be characters who become aware of your vampiric nature and may not respond favorably to it. Probably won't. And yeah,
it's not always specifically the character in and of itself that is the touchstone, but also like the idea of them. Where, if to use the family thing, if they start going through a divorce, that can also fracture the idea of what it means to you as protecting your family, because now the family is breaking up.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, vampires are creatures of stasis. They, of course, never age. Their appearance will never change. Everyone around them will. So when the mortals that they are close to, their touchstones start to change, you run the risk of losing them as touchstones. It's, again, a nice, fun mechanic. It's all profiled in the V5 core book, but I very much recommend anyone new to Vampire comes up with a conviction and a touchstone, links the two together, because it will give them far more opportunities for roleplay. One question we were asked on the Discord before we started recording was, how often should experience be given out in Vampire the Masquerade 5th edition? This is very much down to the storyteller, but the guidelines in the core book is that every player should get 1 experience point per session, and everyone should receive 1 at the end of the story, which generally lasts, 3 or 4 or 5 sessions. Now, you can be more generous, less generous. It really depends on the kind of power level you're going for. But that is the, I guess, guidance that's published.
I think the one thing that they didn't address well in the book about that is that vampires are long-term creatures. You and I may be worried about the rent this month, paycheck next week, birthday next year, something like that, where vampires tend to think in decades and centuries. So if you're getting experience at the rate that many other games do, you're all of a sudden having everybody running around with rank 5 of everything.
Exactly. Now, often it will cost you, let's say, around 15 experience points to increase a point in one of your disciplines, one of your vampire powers. And if you think about that, then experience is given out 1 per session, 1 at the end of the story. So that's going to take quite a while to increase your disciplines. But that is the long game. Vampire the Masquerade isn't a game where you're just going to level up. It is a game where your characters are often punching up, whether it's older vampires who are more powerful than you, which means you are never going to meet them in a white room with, it's just you versus them on an even footing. You have to plan your way around them. You have to think of how to take down that elder vampire, because you're not going to beat them in a straight fight. But you're also punching up at the Second Inquisition in Vampire, who are mortal hunters who are aware of vampires and trying to eliminate you. They have a very big weapon on their side, and that's the sun. So you can see that your characters, while you can prey upon the average citizen of the city who knows nothing about you, the average loner, you can feed from them and no one will ever know. When it comes to bigger society, vampire politics, vampire hierarchy, and governments, the political body among mortals, and intelligence agencies, then you're going to be in trouble. This is why it's called Vampire the Masquerade. You do have to keep your activities discreet, because if you don't, you're probably going to end up with a stake through your heart and facing the dawn.
If you're lucky.
If you're lucky, it might be a lot worse than that.
Yeah, they could stake you and then do experiments on you and feed you blood and then drain it and empower other mortals to then help them fight more vampires. It's just not a great situation. There was 2.5 things I had to follow up on that is if they had a section on planning time skips so that it could be like, hey, here's your story that you got going on that takes, let's say, a month to complete. And then you skip ahead, say 6 months, you can award additional experience there for just time that has passed.
Yep, definitely.
Would have been nice to have a little, 2 paragraphs or something for storytellers about using that as a mechanic.
Yeah, downtime experience, essentially. My suggestion is to anyone who's interested in running Vampire that you still get a sense of what the characters were doing during that downtime. Don't just give them experience because it's been a month since the last time the vampires were active. It's not only good for them to justify why they deserve the experience, as again the name implies, is experience. It's something you have learned. It also gives you material to bounce off of as a storyteller. If someone says they have been hard at work, working night shifts as a vampire, in the supermarket in order to pay off their sister's car or something like that, well, brilliant. That gives you two things as a storyteller. It gives you a supermarket, which is a place where you can engineer meetings, a shithead of an employer, a customer who just strides up to the vampire and says, I know what you are. It also gives you a sister. It gives you their car, which might break down or you may have stolen or whatever, Whenever you have downtimes in a game, whether it's Vampire or anything, always worth getting information as to what were the characters doing at that time.
And then one of the other big changes, since we were talking about eating people, is the predator types that they made here, where it gives you your character's preferred method of getting the blood that they need, and a big change to give you access to things you wouldn't normally have access to, because each one comes with a little bonus of one of 2 disciplines.
Yeah, so predator types aren't straitjackets. They don't force you to play a certain way. There's a clan in Vampire the Masquerade called the Ventru who have what's called a feeding restriction. When you choose to play a Ventru, you have to choose the kind of mortals you can feed from. You can't feed easily from anyone else. You can spend willpower to do it, but that's by the by. With predator types, it does a similar thing where one of the predator types is Sandman, for instance. You prefer to feed from sleeping people, which means you break into houses and feed from them while they're asleep and then break out of the house again and leave them none the wiser, but, maybe slightly anemic. There are other predator types like Bloodleech who only feed from vampires because they feel like vampires are the only prey that should be fed from. Now, predator types are in V5 largely as a player aid, as a way to help construct your character to think about how they're going to feed, because feeding is such a major part of Vampire 5th edition. And as you say, different predator types give different bonuses depending on the one you chose, but they aren't there to restrict you. You're not confined to playing that particular kind of predator for all time by any means. It's just your preference.
It helps to differentiate your clan person from every other clan person that exists.
Definitely.
Because each clan has their 3 specific disciplines that are like, air quotes, theirs, with the option from a potential off-clan discipline from your predator type. It's like, sure, you may be that Ventru who likes to feed from sleeping people, but now he picks up a little bit of obfuscate, or the one that lets them be invisible or undetected. And now suddenly he can walk into that boardroom that Ventru are prone to do without making a sound, and people don't notice him approaching, and all of a sudden he overhears something or can then do that and make himself known and get that social power position almost.
Yeah. Let's say you were sneaking into a boardroom where you're trying to listen in and a vampire overhears you and they decide they're going to start shooting at you. It's a good opportunity to talk about how conflict works. And there's a couple of different rules for conflict in V5, because you can play it the straightforward way, you can play it the simplified way, or you can play it the advanced way. The straightforward way is quite simply, let's say your characters are about to engage in a gunfight. You go left to right from all the players and figure out what they want to do as the conflict is about to start. You basically get them to declare their pools, what dice pools they're going to be rolling, and then you go for it. Let's say some of them are trying to dodge out the way of the gunfire, and so they roll dex and their dexterity and their athletics. They pair those two together. They roll those dice pools. Let's say someone is firing back with their gun. They might roll their composure plus their firearms to take aim, or if they're just quickly shooting without looking, it might be dexterity plus firearms, for instance. This is the way combat works. It's just the same as any other skill roll. Now, when you're opposing someone else, as you often are in a conflict, the winner, one participant rolls their dice pool. The other person rolls their dice pool. The person who rolled highest subtracts the loser's successes from their total. So let's say one person rolls 5 successes, one person rolls 3 successes. The person who rolled 5 takes the 3 off of their successes. They have 2 left, and that is damage, essentially. That's the damage you have dealt to the person who you are attacking in this case. Now, depending on the weapons you're using, let's say this is a physical conflict, you will get additional damage from certain guns and certain types of firearm and the like. Now, in this game, you can also do what is essentially social damage and mental damage as well. Vampires have health and they have willpower. I mentioned willpower earlier. If someone is humiliating you in a vampire court before the rest of the vampires and really dresses you down, makes you look like a complete fool, and you're trying to defend yourself, well, let's say they succeed. And again, let's say after they deduct your successes from theirs, they end up with 2. Well, that does 2 damage to your willpower instead of your health. Now, in what occasion would someone socially rebuking you do additional damage? Like, let's say, if you were being shot at with a sawn-off shotgun at close range, you might get additional damage from that. Well, if you were being humiliated in front of an audience, that does additional damage to your willpower. So that is the equivalent of being attacked with a nasty weapon.
Just that the idea for somebody to make a vampire in court think that they're up there and just their underwear trying to give a report to give extra social damage.
So yeah, but you're getting it. You're getting the point. It's a nice, elegant system. It's very, very simple. It's just, attackers versus defenders. And there's another 2 ways you can play it. But for people first getting into Vampire, it's nice and easy to work that out.
There are 2 aspects of it that I really enjoy, particularly in the meat world combat, not especially the social world, but is the fact that there is no initiative. There's a minor thing of engaged melee combats or hand-to-hand combats, ranged combats, and then like everything else, including new engaged melee combats, so that it's like an order of operations for you to resolve people's dice rolls, but it's not like, all right, I've got a 15, you've got a 12, and then down the list, and you just go around in a circle. It gives you a lot more narrative control over what your characters can do and how they can help each other.
Yeah, it makes it feel like everything's going off simultaneously, as opposed to everyone waiting their turn to get hit or hit someone. And different games have experimented with different initiative systems over the years, of course. Dungeons & Dragons is very famous for having what is essentially whoever's got the most dexterity and rolls the best goes first. There are other games that basically have you rolling initiative, and the person who rolls lowest declares what they're doing first, and then you go up towards the fastest, because the faster people can act based on how they know the slower people are going to act. So there's lots of different ways you can do it. But yeah, in the case of V5, it's pretty much simultaneous action to demonstrate that when action occurs, it is generally pretty frenetic and out of control. It just goes bam, and there's action all of a sudden.
It also helps to keep everybody engaged, because we all know when that after your turn in a, say, D&D, because everybody knows about it, style initiative, you go, and then you have to wait for it to go all the way down and come back around to you, and very little has changed.
Yeah, exactly. And if you just so happen to have rolled a bad roll and it would have been more interesting had you gone first. Well, to use a D&D example, let's say you are the cleric, and I mean, I love playing clerics, but let's say the cleric's major role is for healing other people. Let's assume that. If you happen to roll really well and you're the cleric and you go first, you've got no one to heal. Well, you could hold your action, or you could do something superfluous. But if someone then gets hit really badly on the next turn, well, you've already spent your action and you can't heal them now. It would have been a lot better if you could choose when to act. So it's, different strokes for different folks, but I appreciate how V5 does it.
I have always said that going last in a round of initiative is like going first in the next round. It's the same thing.
Yep, exactly.
The other thing I really like about the way that they have laid things out is the 3 turn and out rule, where after 3 sets of rolls for a thing, you should probably just look at the situation and decide if it really needs to continue or if you can just narrative it out of the scene.
Yeah, the idea behind that, we discussed it at length when we were designing V5, was the fact that combat so rarely ends in white flags or people fleeing or hostages being taken. And that is completely inaccurate in our world and most media for that matter. Most serious media, people will not just all fight each other to the death. But in role-playing games, that is the norm, especially, again, and it sounds like I'm really crapping on D&D. I'm not. I enjoy D&D. I think it's its own game, and
it's good at what it does.
Yeah, it's very, very good at what it does, as is displayed by the number of people who play it. But yeah, the common trend is that people will make every single fight a battle to the death, regardless of whether you're fighting a hill giant, a village of kobolds, or just a bandit. When in reality, what you might do is try and scare one of those groups off. And in Vampire, the fact that at the end of 3 rounds, you are told in the book what you should do at that point is determine how does the battlefield look? Where are people in relation to each other? Is someone likely to surrender? Are the police likely to show up at this point? That kind of thing. It makes you start thinking about your conflict in context, which I think is excellent for narrative purposes. Certainly more interesting than rolling and rolling and rolling until someone drops down dead.
And they do a lot of other things that are really nice that a lot of other systems get caught up in, things like tracking ammunition and, times per day you can use a thing. And all of the rest of the stuff. The armor system, with the fact that armor is, air quotes, mostly useless to vampires, is also really interesting.
Yeah, it basically gives you a static defense and makes you more likely to essentially absorb damage. Cover does the same thing during ranged combat. Yeah, but sorry, you carry on.
Sorry, where it turns what would be more serious aggravated damage into superficial damage, but as a vampire, you don't take aggravated damage from a whole lot of things. A mortal who gets stabbed or shot is going to have a real bad time, but for a vampire, it's like,
Yep, exactly, because most damage that's inflicted to a vampire, all damage comes in 2 forms, superficial and aggravated, both to willpower and health. Now, as you say, bullets, fists, blades, all treated as superficial damage as far as a vampire is concerned, unless that blade is going through your heart. The things that do aggravated damage, and these are the things you really need to worry about, are fire, the sun, certain holy weapons, holy water, for instance, true faith. That's where a vampire needs to be concerned. The good news is most of the time vampires don't have to worry about it, because how often are you running around in the daylight? The bad news is you're still fairly vulnerable. If someone decides to unload an assault rifle into you, that superficial damage is going to rack up quickly. if you're not doing something to get away. The one advantage you have over the humans who are having the exact same thing happen to them is you can get up and run, and you would probably evade the person shooting at you before you died. Whereas a human would take every single one of those bullets as aggravated and would just drop down dead before they could even tie their shoelaces.
However, vampires do still have a use for that Kevlar vest, because when you get shot and you fall down, but then you get back up, people are like, oh God, you got shot. And you're like, oops, I'm a vampire. I can't tell them that. Where if you pull open your shirt and you're like, Kevlar vest.
Yep, exactly.
A lot
Always keep the masquerade. I'm glad you're thinking of it. The camera will appreciate you.
I'm sure that they will. Oh, man. I'm sure that we could keep going forever. I'm not sure if you have anything else big that's major to the system that we should
That's pretty much all of the main system beats that we've covered in just over an hour, so not bad going, really. The main things for new players to keep in mind are D10s is always D10s. Always add an attribute to a skill, but never feel like you have to pair a certain attribute and a certain skill to achieve something. Be creative. If you think that your dexterity plus technology makes more sense than intelligence or wits plus technology to hotwire that car because you're trying to work quickly, then say to the storyteller, can I use dex plus technology in this case? And usually they'll just say yes, because the game rewards you for making creative pairings as long as you can justify it in some way.
But don't be that guy who's got 4 dots in dexterity and wants to dexterity plus intimidation to knife juggle at somebody, because haha.
Well, you can.
Yeah.
But yeah, the other thing to keep in mind is play with your character's flaws. Hunger is there on every single person's sheet. Every single vampire has a bane. Every single vampire has compulsions that they will play with when they make their bestial failures. Play them up, because this is a game where it's fun to fail. It makes your story more interesting. Stories where you succeed every single time become dull very, very quickly. But having a game where you actually care about your touchstones, your mortal acquaintances, having a game where you decide that your character likes to hold off from feeding until the last possible moment so as not to actually become a monster, will make for a more rewarding gaming experience for you than if you're just someone who says, oh, well, I'm on hunger 1 now, so I better kill someone tonight. That leads to very black and white playing in the end, and not terribly rewarding.
I am very blessed by the players that I have and some of the things that have happened in our game so far. I really should find out who made this quote and what book it first showed up in, but I keep forgetting to. But it was basically the advice of drive your character like a stolen car.
Yep, that's very good advice.
Don't be like, oh no, nothing bad could ever happen to poor old Mary Sue. Get Mary Sue out there, let her get punched in the face and realize she's not awesome.
Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with ending that stolen car story like Thelma and Louise. If your story is reaching a denouement and your character's achieved everything you want to achieve with that character, feel free to send them off in a graceful and interesting way so that you can roll up a new one with new convictions, new touchstones, new stats, and tell a new story.
And that's why we're all here, really, is to tell not very specific stories, but specifically to tell stories.
Yep, exactly.
To find out what is going to happen next. All right.
Well, I hope that's been helpful.
I hope it has been too. It has been a pleasure to just sit and talk and pick your brain over the past however long this recording is, but thank you very much for the time and the opportunity.
It is an absolute pleasure. People can always find me on MathewDawkins.com. As I say, I have my full list of credits there. I think it's full. Might need updating, but it's pretty extensive. I have a contact button on there should you wish to reach out to me via that website as well. I also have a Patreon. Most of the people who back my Patreon do it so they can play games that I'm running. I'm currently running 5 games on my Patreon right now, but I'm always happy to run more, because without trying to sound too mercenary, if people are paying for my time and energy, I will give both to them. And that it basically translates as me being able to keep the lights on, but also getting to run games, which is something I enjoy doing. And right now I'm running V5, I'm running V20 Dark Ages, I'm running Cthulhu by Gaslight, I am running Call of Cthulhu, and I am running a game called Broken Rooms. If people want to check out the kinds of things I've written, they can definitely, of course, look at V5. Most specifically, they'll get the biggest taste of the kind of developer and writer I am if they look at books like Chicago by Night, Cults of the Blood Gods, Let the Streets Run Red, the Chicago Folios, as those are books I developed, which means I oversaw the writing teams as well as writing for them, developed the entire thing, and they've done very well. But the games I would love if people checked out, if they like what I have to say, They Came From Beneath the Sea and They Came From Beyond the Grave. They Came From Beneath the Sea is available to buy already on drivethrurpg.com. And They Came From Beyond the Grave can be pre-ordered. It's currently being put together. The book is already fully written. We're just waiting for all the art to come in. And you can pre-order that on a website called BackerKit. I will make sure all of the links are sent to Bruno so that he can post them in whatever kind of log you do with these episodes.
I will have it somewhere that I can link you on the Discord. I'll have it in the episode description, and it'll be up on our website underneath where you can listen to it there, and all of the links and stuff.
Perfect.
And wherever else I can really find room to stick it. I do have a last minute question I thought of.
Oh yes, go ahead.
Do you have a favorite V5 thing that you wrote?
That's an interesting question. No one has asked that of me before, actually.
Because I can't ask you if you have a favorite part, because that's unfair. It's like asking if you have a favorite child.
Well, that's not true. I do have a favorite child. Luckily, I only have one of them, though.
There's the rub.
So there's a few things I'm really quite pleased with that have just that don't feel artificial in V5. They have been invented for V5, but they feel like they could have always existed in Vampire the Masquerade. And one of them is a very simple concept. It's a group called the Circulatory System. And while I worked on a lot on V5, the core, the Camarilla book, the Anarch book, and all the subsequent ones, the Circulatory System were a group invented for the second playtest material for V5 of human blood traffickers. They are basically caterers for Kindred who want to drink certain types of blood, gain certain blood resonances, or if they're Ventru, because they have a refined palate. And so they place an order with this body called the Circulatory System, who will essentially snatch and grab or pay off people to deliver them to vampires so that those vampires can feed from them. Now, the Circulatory System have ended up appearing in books I've developed, books I've written on, and and products I haven't had any contact with. And when I see people speaking about it, and it's a really minor thing, but when I see people referencing it on Discord or on forums or in actual plays, and knowing they just used them because they were there, that makes me feel proud of the material, more so than even anything system-wise that I might have contributed, because they have just seen it and thought, yeah, this makes sense. Of course there's blood traffickers, it's Vampire the Masquerade. And frankly, I think the name is very smart as well. It would be that.
I will make a little asterisk there to see if I can fit them in somewhere.
You can find out a little more about them in Chicago by Night, but yeah, I think they appear in pretty much every product that's been released now.
Very cool, very cool. Yeah, I will be sure to get you a link of stuff when we put the episode lives and stuff so you can see it and all of that goodness.
Well, thank you very much. It's been my absolute pleasure. I remain a big fan of Vampire the Masquerade. Other than the clans in the Vampire Companion, I've written every single clan for V5, and seeing how people respond to that material is incredibly gratifying. And being asked to appear on shows like this and talk to new players, people interested in getting into Vampire, is, well, it's wonderful, because I started out as a fan. I'm still a fan. Being able to provide material like this that helps other people get into the game is just fantastic.
Your kind words warm my cold, dead heart.
Not too much, I hope.
No, nothing so... I don't know, something...
Not enough to do aggravated damage.
Yeah, there you go. It's like, oh god, I can't heal my heart because it's all aggravated. And with that, thank you very much for coming on, and I will get you that list of that stuff we talked about, all those other AP podcasts that I listen to.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. And get rid of Craig. Goodbye, Craig.